I was on the fence about this.
Yes.
Feels a little bit risky. I want to start with the story that I've not told before, and I'll be really honest, doesn't have anything to do with strong towns. But I'm hoping that by the end of the session, you're like, okay, he made that case. I can see why he brought that up. And in fact, it doesn't even take place in North America. It takes place on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. I'll take you back to November 2004. There were these two giant energy corporations in the United Kingdom, and they filed an application to build what would have been Europe's largest wind farm. And it was going to be built on the Brindled Moor, which is a large moor, several hundred square miles in size, on the Isle of Lewis in northwest Scotland. And this wind farm was going to consist of 234 wind turbines, each of which would stand more than 450 feet high, with a blade span longer than a Boeing 747. Each turbine was going to be sunk into a foundation of some 24,000 cubic feet of concrete. And to service these wind turbines, as well as the power lines and the other infrastructure that would be required to transport the energy off the island, they were going to build 104 miles of road, along with 9 electrical substations. They were going to create 5 new rock quarries, as well as 4 concrete batching plants. And in all, more than 176 million cubic feet of rock and about 88 million cubic feet of peat were going to be excavated and displaced. And in their application to build, these energy partners acknowledged that the effect on the landscape on the landscape, resource, character, and perception of the island would be major and would be long term. And so I first came across this story in a book by Robert Macfarlane, a book called Landmarks. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And as Macfarlane describes in this book, the plan sparked a 3.5-year battle over the nature and future of the moor. 80% of locals were against the plan, even though it meant more jobs, more development, and more money for an island that had a struggling economy and very high unemployment. And at the heart of this debate, Macfarlane says, was the perceived nature and worth of the moor itself and the language that was used to describe it. Supporters of the plan described the Brindled Moor as a wasteland and as a hostile wilderness. One journalist said it was a vast, dead space, dark brown moors and black locks under a gray sky, all swept by a chill, wet wind. And so for these powerful outside interests, the Brindled Moor really was not a place at all, but rather it was an empty space. It was a blank canvas for them to paint their fortunes upon. And through a kind of industrial alchemy, these crude materials of the Brindled Moor, the peat and the rock and the wind, would be turned into gold. Money, of course, but also the increased power capacity of Scotland that it legitimately needed, and from a relatively clean source. The islanders who opposed the wind farm had a sliver of the financial resources that these giant corporations did with which to press their case. They couldn't afford a public relations campaign. They were going to have to be creative in how they challenged this permit application. And later in the session, we will find out how they did that. Here's why I think that this relates. Because much like the Isle of Lewis, Strong Towns advocates are fighting a David versus Goliath battle. We have this very audacious goal where we are out to change the multi-trillion-dollar North American development pattern. And we are doing this with a sliver of the resources of sort of the entrenched interests, but especially with the sliver, we are fighting inertia. We are fighting the status quo. So we are up against it, but we are seeing progress, due in no small part to the hundreds of local Strong Towns groups that we call local conversations. A local conversation, what is a local conversation? Over the course of the last couple of years, I've kind of settled on this definition. Local conversation is a group of people in a particular place who are coming together to talk about the Strong Towns approach, and then they're working together to put it into action where they live. As of this morning, there are 211 local conversations around North America. And you can kind of see that there are some bare spots, but like those will be filled in soon. But you can see that they are all over the United States, and we're getting more and more in Canada as well. In addition to those 211 local conversations that are up and running, 140 of those have been started in just the last 19 months. So this is growing very, very quickly. Chuck, if you were at the session last night, I think Chuck said, John, no offense, but it's been kind of nuts, right? And it has been. But like Chuck says, like these are the as we have struggled to keep up with the interest, Chuck says like these are the problems that come not from failure but from success. Because we are seeing hundreds and thousands of advocates just like you step up to learn more about starting a local conversation. We believe that there will be 1,000 local conversations around the world by the year 2027, because we have, in recent months, received interest from people who would like to start local groups, multiple groups in Australia, in New Zealand, in Ireland, and even one, I know, in the Netherlands. And it's hard to believe, but I was talking with the person who's interested in starting one in Rotterdam, and she said, hey, like the good and the bad coexist here as well. And so we believe that there will be 1,000 local groups around the world by 2027. So those 211 local conversations, there are about 400 local conversation leaders right now. And in addition to those 400 existing leaders of existing groups, there are 2,169 people who have recently raised their hand to learn more about starting a local group in 956 additional places. Now, many of these groups won't get off the ground. Like we know that, like, or at least not right now. And so we're not gonna like take those numbers to the bank, but like this is the huge amount of interest that we have seen. And I'd like to point out that all of those pins on that map represent real people. And so here are just some pictures, pretty much at random, of some of our local conversations. Strong Towns PDX in Portland, Oregon, near where I live in Silverton, Oregon. Strong Towns Grand Rapids. Strong Towns Milwaukee. There's a group called Baltimoreans for People-Oriented Places, or BALTPOP for short. We have a number of like people-oriented places groups. So we have Vermonters for People-Oriented Places that go by VPOP. My colleague Norm runs a group in Delta, British Columbia called DELPOP. There is an OPOP that started in Olympia. I feel like there's some other pops too that I'm forgetting. But anyway, you don't have to use Strong Towns in the name. But so in the Strong Towns Santa Barbara and Strong Towns Steubenville. One of the things that I kind of like to just briefly spend a little bit of time on, we're going against like these massive, we're up against Goliath. We're up against inertia. We're up against the status quo. We're up against all of this money. We're up against conventional thinking. And yet here Strong Towns is saying, like, what we need, if we think of local conversations as Strong Towns in real life, this is where Strong Towns gets actualized. Why do we focus so much on the local and on the conversation? I think that, so here's some reasons why we focus on the local. First of all, the local is where we live. It's in our day-to-day lives in the neighborhood that we experience the effects of the decisions that are being made by us and for us at all levels of government. We also, at Strong Towns, we believe that local government is a collection of us. Like, we don't see local government as the lowest rung on the scale of government, sort of like, I think I've heard Chuck said, describe, as we don't see local government as kind of the algae of government, sort of looking up the food chain. No, we actually see local government as the highest place where we are coming together as neighbors to make decisions about our community. Another reason, everything you care about at the national level has a local analog. This is, I think, especially something to consider in an election year. For example, we can't have a strong national economy without a strong, dynamic local, without a nation of strong, dynamic, and local economies. Strong countries need strong cities, towns, and neighborhoods. A few years ago, I interviewed this man who for about 40 years had been a traveling salesman all around the Midwest. And early in his career, he saw all of these rural communities in Iowa and Kansas and elsewhere kind of go all in on the suburban experiment all at one time. And now 40 years later, he's seeing them all decline at exactly the same time. He found strong towns when he was looking for an explanation of what was going wrong with all of these communities that he so dearly loved. Another reason why local is because you are the expert on your place. It's very possible that no one is coming to save our towns and cities. And that if they do, it may not be the help we actually need. No outsider, however well-meaning, is going to know your neighborhood as well as you do. We also believe that it's at the local where you can best positively affect change. We believe that the local level is the most receptive to feedback. Strong Towns approach, as you know, is built on many, many small bets, but we're constantly learning from these experiments and then adapting based on what we learn. Feedback at the state and federal level can be very dulled by distance and bureaucracy, but whereas at the local level, it can be felt and acted upon with greater speed and effectiveness. And if I would say, if you're going to take a picture of any slide today, you don't have to do this. This is like, I would want you to walk away with this. Thank you. You're doing it. This is, I think, it's a deceptively simple process, but it's so exceptionally profound. When a local group asked me, okay, like, where should we start? How should we start taking action? I will say, go on a walk with this process in mind. Step one is to humbly observe where people in your community are struggling. Step two is to ask the question, what's the next smallest thing that we can do to address that struggle? Don't wait for a grant. Just, don't ask for permission necessarily. Just identify what that is, and then step three, do that thing and do it right now. And then step four is to repeat that process again and again and again. And in a moment, I'll share an example of one of our local conversations in Charlotte who did just that. And finally, it's why local? Because we need to show them how it's done. Every place using a Strong Towns approach to build strength and prosperity and resilience from the bottom up and working with neighbors, I see us as a kind of a demonstration plot for what we want and need for the whole country. So that's why local, but why conversation? Two simple reasons. One is it implies familiarity and it implies relationships. I'm a writer, and so I love etymology. And I was delighted to learn recently that our word conversation comes from a Middle English word that means to live among. It implies familiarity and intimacy, and its Latin root means to keep company with. And so a Strong Towns local group happens at the ground level over time in familiar places. It happens among neighbors, and it builds on local knowledge, and it requires a process of continual learning. Members of a local conversation keep company with our neighbors. Something that I always joke, like if anybody's doing a Windleberry drinking game, like you can take your first shot now. He's my favorite writer. I struggle to not quote him when I give a presentation, but here it is, first quote. From my favorite writer, Windleberry, who's over the state line in Kentucky. He says, a viable neighborhood and a viable community is made up of neighbors who cherish and protect what they have in common. I sometimes think about this as people coming together on common ground. And I don't actually mean sort of like common values necessarily. I mean the actual literal ground that we share. Our places, our physical places that we share. People coming together on common ground around common interests, working together for the common good. That is what happens with our local conversations. And finally, of course, a conversation implies relationships. There's an image that we come back to often as a Strong Towns staff, just as we're talking amongst ourselves and kind of thinking, how can we be helping people? How can we be that guy that Chuck talked about? And it's this image of a lone advocate kind of standing up at a city council meeting to oppose some budget-busting infrastructure project that she knows is going to be bad for the community long term, or to support removing parking minimums, or to support putting in a bike lane. And she may know that sort of psychically the whole Strong Towns movement is behind her, but it can still be a very lonely feeling, as many of you probably know, to be that lone voice in the room. What is so powerful about local conversations is that you are no longer that lone person in the room. Like, you have the whole Strong Towns movement behind you, not only not in the abstract, but you have actual people next to you. And that feeling of knowing that you are no longer alone is so very, very powerful. Local conversations they're more effective, and they are more fun when they are done in relationship. This is not just something that we have discovered over time at Strong Towns. It's also borne out in a lot of literature. And I would recommend the research of Hari Han, and this book in particular, How Organizations Develop Activists. What Hari Han has discovered is that we are much more likely to be effective when we are working together as teams, as small teams, rather than as lone wolves. And so we've learned a lot from her. At Strong Towns, we sometimes describe the Strong Towns movement as a bottom-up revolution. And I think this, as you can see here, why I think local conversations are such a key part of that bottom-up revolution. They're bottom-up because they well up from the local, and they're revolutionary because they are comprised of groups who are meeting to talk about the Strong Towns approach, and then putting that into action with people who become friends and in a place that you love in common. So what does a local conversation do? Every spring, we do a survey. And so it takes about 5 minutes. We ask our local conversation leaders to fill it out. We ask questions like, how can Strong Towns help the work that you're doing? What are some of your priority issues? What are some of the ways that you're taking action? And unsurprisingly, what we find is that the issues that are a priority for our groups, as well as the ways in which they're taking action, are as bespoke as the places themselves. And so you can see here, this is from April 2023. We're actually doing the wrapping up the spring 2024 survey right now. But you can see that our most common priority issue among our local groups is bikeability and walkability, making streets safer and more productive, housing, public transit, and so on. So a huge range. Many of them are working on, like, even down to local food systems, fighting highways, making city finances more accessible and transparent. And so anything that you see with an asterisk is kind of designates that as one of our 5 priority campaigns that we have at Strong Towns. Ending parking minimums, housing, fighting freeway expansions, transparent local accounting, and safer and more productive streets. But now we also asked, how are they taking action? I'm really interested to see the results of this year's survey. But in last year's survey, more than half of the groups are meeting regularly one-on-one with local leaders, local elected officials, city staffers, small business owners, just developing those relationships over time. More than half of them are speaking up regularly at city council meetings and planning commission meetings. Nearly half of them are supporting the work of other like-minded organizations in their area. Here's an example from Strong Towns Grand Rapids. Chuck talked a little bit about this yesterday with the Bike Ballet program. There's another bike advocacy organization in Grand Rapids that they collaborated with to do this Bike Ballet program. There is a program in Grand Rapids called, I think it's like Food Truck Fridays as the event, and they noticed that there was no bike parking where this was happening. And so they stepped up and they provided bike valet parking, really for 2 reasons. One was to solve this very, very concrete problem, not enough bike parking available, but also to demonstrate to the city on sort of a cultural level that more people would bike to this event if bike parking was available. That's something we're going to talk about a little bit later, and that's a hint at why I think Brindle Moore is going to be, at least why I find it to be such an inspirational story. Because our local conversations don't just solve technical problems. They are making new culture. They are culture-making organizations in our communities. And I think that that's really powerful. Many of our groups are organizing events. This is in your left-hand side. This is Vermonters for People-Oriented Places. They did a screening of a documentary called Street Project. This is actually their very first meeting of their local conversation. They collaborated with a bike organization. 75 people came for the documentary screening. And then this, on the bottom right-hand corner, this is a group called the Bloomington Revivalists. Noah Tang was in my session earlier talking about his work with this group. This was an April morning of almost exactly a year ago when they did their first city cleanup event. And It was 40 degrees and hailing, and still 27 people showed up, and they collected 20 bags of trash. Among those 27 people were 2 city councilors. Something that I learned today, well, I knew that they had continued to do this month after month after month, but something I learned today at our session from Noah is that when the city council now asks their group to come and say, and to essentially they ask, like, what are you seeing on the ground? Like, what are you seeing that we should know? You're out there on the street, on the pavement, cleaning up. Like, they'll also go and give testimony at city council about where they sort of the areas of the community where like the most kind of trash and stuff is really collecting. And the city has stepped up and is now like going to be changing. They're going to be adding more receptacles for like people to dispose of cigarette butts because of what they're seeing on the ground. And I remember when Noah first told me about this, it was almost, I don't want to overstate, but it was almost kind of like embarrassed. Like, well, like, oh, this is our first thing. What we did was like, it's kind of not much, but like we went out and we picked up the trash. And I said at today's session, I share with Chuck all the time, like every single day, what our local conversations are doing. He was as excited about that as I have seen him about anything, from freeway fighting to anything, because this is unsexy work, but it matters. We like to say that if you love your community, it will love you back. And we also have a saying, you maintain what you love. And here was this group of people who could be anywhere on that April morning. And they were out there picking up trash because they love Bloomington, Illinois. And they've done it month after month after month. And they have a reputation now as people who love their place. And now they get requests from other neighborhoods. Will you come in and kind of organize a neighborhood cleanup in ours? And they're cleaning up a neighborhood, and people who have businesses there or homes there get off the porch and they jump in. Like, they are building a culture of care in their community through this, seemingly unsexy work. We're going to bring the sexy work of maintenance back. We have groups that are Justin Timberlake reference, if anybody gets it. We have groups that are appearing regularly in local media. Here's examples from Baltimore, Steubenville, Noah, and Bloomington. Very, very common for them to, be interviewed in newspapers, radios, interviews, podcasts, and then lots of others here. We have groups that are organizing neighborhood walks and community bike rides. This is the session and it's the session last night. Chuck mentioned Stormtown's PDX. And these look like fake pink bollards on the back of their bikes, because that's exactly what they are. They're fake pink bollards. And so there's a 3-day bike festival in Portland called Pedalpalooza. And what Stormtown's PDX does is they will go around and they will install fake pink bollards in the place where they think real bollards should go. And they also started the Billion Bollards Club that Chuck mentioned last night. So it's a fun way of just getting out, being part of a city festival, enjoying the time on your bike, but also saying, like, here's some low-cost ways that we can make our cities safer for people who are walking and biking. And then I'll tell a quick story about the Charlotte Urbanists. This is the story about the 4-Step Project. The Charlotte Urbanists in Charlotte, North Carolina, they do a lot. They do Jane's Walks, they do community bike rides, they do what they call public policy power hours, where there's like street level policy discussions. So they're on the street, like saying, like, hey, what do you see? And then they're talking about it from a policy standpoint. Well, they were on one of their Jane's Walks as a group. They do one a month. And they were on a walk with the 4-step process in mind. And so they were out on the street and they were humbly observing step 1, where people are struggling. And something that they noticed was that in many of the bus stops around Charlotte, especially in the poorest neighborhoods, the bus stops didn't offer even a modicum of comfort and safety for people who were using transit. There was no shelter, there was no bench. It was often right next to a busy road. It was unsafe, uncomfortable. And so they said, well, okay, step 2, what is the next smallest thing that we can do to address this struggle, to make it even just a little bit safer, a little bit more comfortable for somebody using transit? And they said, well, we can build a bus bench. So they pooled together $100 of their money. I think they used some old recycled church pews, and they built a bus bench, and they installed it at a bus stop, and they said, let's see if anybody uses it, if anybody steals it, or if the city takes it away, because they didn't ask for permission. This is not legal advice, but this happens. This is Strong Towns. So they didn't ask for permission. They just did it. And they built it, they installed it, and they watched. Not only did the city not take it away, not only did nobody steal it, but people seemed grateful for the opportunity to have a place to sit. And they said, okay, that seemed to work. Let's repeat that. What happens next? So they built a few more, and a few more. Pretty soon, they did a GoFundMe, and to date, they have built more than 90 bus benches around Charlotte. And in a meeting of the Regional Transit Authority, as the Regional Transit Authority, which has millions of dollars to spend on bus benches and bus stops, when they were trying to decide if they should use some of their own money in order to install bus stops, the Charlotte Urbanist Bus Bench campaign was brought up as proof of concept. If we know, like, these people are out here doing our work, and we know that if bus benches are installed, then more people will use them. So not only is it so that's building a culture in Charlotte, but as we'll see, it's also building a culture among local conversations, and we'll get to that in a moment. This is a group called Allendale Strong, in Allendale neighborhood in Shreveport, Louisiana, and they describe themselves as a learning and doing group. And they're doing a ton of stuff. They're fighting a freeway expansion that they've been faithfully fighting for many, many years. They are doing a corner store food co-op. They're improving. Oh, that's in bad timing. They started a hyper-local podcast. And then they have joined now with 4 other local conversations around Louisiana for what they call the Four Corners Coalition. And they're working towards what they call the unstroding of Louisiana. So like they are working more now on a regional level as well. So how do you start a local conversation? I'll be honest, like I'm going to sort of go very, very broad with this because in January of this year, we launched a free course for people who would like to start a local conversation. You'll see the link for that here in a moment. So I'm going to sort of go high level with it because what I want to focus on at the end of my talk, and then we'll have some questions. The session was, how do you start a local conversation that has impact? So I'm going to give a very general overview, but I'm going to focus in on what we have seen from the local conversations that are really having the most impact. What we have seen now, working with 211 local groups, and frankly, some groups that have tried getting started and haven't, what we have learned is that while the specifics are very, very different from one place to the next, most local conversations go through this general journey. There's kind of a startup phase where they're like connecting with one another for the first time. Then they are learning to connect with others, like outside of that core nucleus. Then they're learning how to communicate their message in their community, whether it's on social media or in person, giving talks. Then they're learning to advocate. Sorry. And then they're learning to actually like take action together. And then most groups spend the vast majority of their time in sort of the stage we call transforming the community. And that is the deep, deep transformational work. So we'll touch on these as we go along. But here's that. If you go to academy.strongtowns.org, you will find this free local conversation course that we created. We launched it in January as part of Local Conversations Week. I will give you a heads up. It is very in-depth. It's like 2.5 hours long. Chuck, Norm, and I did put this together, and we're adding new sessions to it here over the course of the next couple of months. Norm says, John, tell them to watch it on 2x speed. So it's not. But the reason it's in depth is because we get asked a lot of the same questions, like very good questions, with every single group. And so we said, let's create this course where we answer all of those questions. And so Chuck is like, he kind of is more philosophical about it. It's like, okay, if you're going to start like a local group from a Strong Towns perspective, like here's how we would approach it philosophically. My wife would laugh to hear me say this, but like I'm super practical because like I'm working day in, day out with like 200 plus groups. I'm like, I know that these are the questions. So I'm like, okay, how do you, I don't know if this is the real number, but how do you find other Strong Towns advocates near you? I think I give 12 ways, like just 12 ideas, just to kind of spark your imagination. And then Norm is kind of right in the middle. So it's a mixture of voices, and then we have like some of our other colleagues at some of the later sessions. So with the promise that many of the more specific questions are going to be answered in this course, I am going to give you just kind of a heads up, a high-level overview. Also, if you want to learn if you want to kind of start the process, the very first step is to see if there's already a group in your area. And then if there's not, to sign up, you can sign up for an orientation call. Like we try to get you connected with Strongtown staff as very early in the process as possible, so that you know that we're here, we're available, we want to walk with you. And so that's at strongtowns.org/local, where you can find out if there's a group near you. So step one, really step one is going to strongtowns.org/local, but this is kind of like more of a high level thing. This is kind of an obvious step, but in some ways it's the hardest. Because again and again, people who are part of a local conversation talk about how frustrated they were when they looked at some of the decisions that their town or city was making. And they started asking questions like, why are people on foot and on bike still getting injured or killed at this intersection year after year after year? Why is the road in front of my house years behind maintenance? Why do North American cities look like this when Europeans and Asian cities get to look like that? Why do we seem to keep prioritizing automobiles over people? Why can't we fill all of these vacant storefronts downtown? Why does my public library close at 4:30 in the afternoon? Why are people who grew up in my town and who would stay here if they could, why are they forced to move away because they can't afford to live here? Another one that I had recently, this was really interesting, especially considering that Blue Zones is here. I was talking with somebody recently who said, he was kind of telling me his Strongtown's origin story. He said he was watching the Blue Zones documentary on Netflix. Has anybody seen that? It's a gorgeous documentary. It's really powerful, beautifully shot. And if you don't know what the Blue Zones are, these are places around the world that have a much higher percentage than normal of people who live to be 100 years or older. And for decades, researchers have been studying the Blue Zones to figure out, what do these places have in common? They're geographically very spread out. There's Okinawa, Japan. There's one or two places in Mexico, Loma Linda, California. I think one or two in Italy, and maybe one in Greece and elsewhere. What do these very disparate places have in common? And as they've been doing all of this research, they have found some of the things that they have in common. And as this man was watching, he's in his early 50s, as he was watching this, and he kind of keyed in on three things in particular that these communities have in common. Number one that stood out for him was, he said that if people in these places, if they're going somewhere, chances are they are walking or biking. The second is people are able to age in proximity to their adult children. And then the third was they are surrounded by social circles that encourage healthy behavior. And he looked at, somebody in their early 50s, looked at his life and he realized three things. Number one, there was no place that worth walking to that he could walk to safely or bike to safely in his neighborhood. Number two, he noticed that, but he realized that if he wanted to live in proximity to his adult children, both of them would have to move out of their existing neighborhoods because there is not a variety of housing stock that is accessible for people across ages and income levels, and people who need different sizes of houses. So they would have to both leave their neighborhoods and find one that happened to have that. And then finally, he noticed that he did have these social circles that promoted healthy behavior, but he had to drive to get there. And so what happens when he couldn't drive? And as he started asking himself these questions, why can't I do these things? He found Strong Towns and then started learning more about local conversations. So people are asking these questions, and as they go looking for answers, they find Strong Towns, and they start to kind of experience a kind of a dissonance. And this is a screenshot from a video that my colleague Mike did a while back, where he's like, maybe it's just time to pack up the cat and move to Amsterdam or something. because they wish that somebody would do something about it in their town or city. And they're like, I'm somebody. I can do something about it. And that's how they find out about the Local Conversations program. At that point, they've made a decision that they are no longer going to be passive observers of the decline of their town or city, but rather active participants in making it better. Something I also like to point out is local conversation leaders come from all walks of life. They do include some built environment professionals like planners and architects and engineers, as well as some city staff, some city officials. But they also include young activists and retirees, students and nonprofit leaders, small business owners, men, women, introverts, extroverts. You do not have to be a so-called expert to start a local conversation. You don't have to be an extrovert. The vast majority of the people who start and join our local conversations have never gotten involved in their community before. Which I just think is stunning to me. So I've never heard anybody say this, but I can hear maybe somebody saying, "Oh, like you're working with rookies." No. Like these are people who have found something that have gotten them off the sidelines and into the game. Our Strong Towns group in Los Angeles was started by a high school teacher and one of the students who found out that they had Strong Towns in common. We have groups that are started by college students in the town that they're living in that they hope to stay in after graduation. Like I said, all over the spectrum. So while the makeup of the group is very diverse in that sense, what they have in common, I would say, is a particular posture. They are passionate while also being humble. They are good at coming up with ideas while still being very, very curious. They have the passion of their convictions, but they're also committed to working across political and ideological differences. And they want to get stuff done, but they also recognize that the best way to be successful in their advocacy, and frankly, just to have more fun, is by connecting with others in their town or city. Which brings us to step 2, which is connection. When you sign up at strongtowns.org/local, you will see if there are other folks near you. We can help connect you with other people near you. I mentioned that there will be an orientation call, so immediately you're getting connected with staff. But eventually, you start wanting to get connected with neighbors. And so the question is, if you want to connect with others, how do you know who the Strong Towns advocates are near you? What if your friends and colleagues don't know about Strong Towns yet? We like to say that you're surrounded by Strong Towns advocates, they just don't know it yet. Because while people around you may not have heard of Strong Towns specifically, you are surrounded by people who share your love for your community. You may find, I have found one of the most powerful Strong Towns conversations I had was walking with my own daughter to school and asking her, what are your hopes for this place? And she talked I saw the neighborhood through her eyes, at half the size of me, and realized that she has very different priorities than I had been thinking of for myself. And so just having conversations with neighbors, what are your hopes for our place? There are people who don't know Strong Towns, but they're passionate about Strong Towns ideas like bikeability, walkability, municipal. I don't know if you can find somebody who's passionate about municipal finance. Good for you. That's awesome. We need more people who are passionate about that. Anyway, so for some of the friends where I live, their entry points into Strong Towns was the fact that our sidewalk system in our town is so intermittent and dangerous in places. I know of people who got connected with colleagues after work. I know people who struck up a conversation while they were waiting to pick up their kids at school. My colleague Norm started his group, but he was attending city council sessions, and he would listen for the people who sounded like kindred spirits, and he would go up to them afterwards and introduce themselves. So there are lots and lots of ways. And so one of the things that is, I think maybe surprising for some people to hear, because we have this massive email list. And the way that we used to do our local conversations is when somebody wanted to start a local group, we would put them on that map with their contact information. And we would email everybody on our email list in that area and say, hey, so-and-so wants to start this group in Austin or wherever. What we discovered when I came on board was that many of the pins in our map were for groups that had never actually gotten off the ground. It was the pandemic, like people had not been able to really connect for a long time. There were lots of like very valid and good reasons, but many of these groups had never actually gotten started. So in January 2022, thanks in part to this research from Hari Han, we changed up our process a little bit. And so now what we ask local conversation leaders is to meet at least one time with at least 2 other people. Again, it's not important that those folks have heard of Strong Towns. But what happens is like it's a small but significant threshold that we ask organizers to take. People who have been on the, who may not have gotten involved in the past, all of a sudden are community organizers because they have met with, like 3 of them met, like they're organizing, they're building community. And then you let us know, and at that point, we consider your group to be up and running. Like there's now a local conversation in your place. And then we put your group on the map, and then we email everybody on our email list with a high degree of confidence that there is something happening. People are already meeting. There's already momentum. And so that's how we know, and as of course we're keeping in touch, but how we can have such a high degree of confidence that the groups the pins on our map, like these are active groups. These are people who have taken that small but significant step. Step 3 is conversation. I'm actually not going to. I'll kind of zip through this a little bit if I'm being honest, because I think some of it is hopefully inspiring, but also maybe a little bit self-evident. Groups, I will say, when they first get up and running, what we encourage groups to do is to spend the first few months focused. Don't like go out and try to fight a freeway project. Unless it's happening right now and just do it. But like spend some time getting to know one another. Who's in the room? Get everybody on the same page with some Strong Towns ideas and Strong Towns language. And so the vast majority of our groups will spend a few months focused on education and relationship building. Education can look a lot of different ways. It might be a book club, might be going through a Strong Towns Academy course together, going through our curbside chat videos. How many folks here are familiar with Not Just Bikes? Okay, like kind of about half. Not Just Bikes is a very popular YouTube channel. They did a Strong Towns series, and so we created a set of discussion guides that local groups are using to kind of go through the Not Just Bikes series together. So we have lots of different resources. And then they're focusing on relationship building. They start by simply getting to know who's in the room. Where are you coming from? Like, what are you passionate about? I'm sorry to be going kind of fast, but I want time for questions and stuff. Tip number 2 is to practice talking together with one another across differences. This is something that's really important to us at Strong Towns. We feel like there are a vanishingly few places where people are able to still come together and work around common interests for the common good. And we take it very seriously that Strong Towns is one of those places, and our local conversations take that seriously as well. Tip number 3 is to be consistent and to be persistent, almost to an irrational degree. Jordan Deffenbaugh in Strong Towns Sioux Falls, like he and his co-founder met for 6 weeks at the same place every single week, just the 2 of them. Most groups, by the way, meet once a month, so you don't think it's like a week-long thing that we recommend, or a weekly thing. But they meet every single week. And one time, Jordan's his co-organizer Clinton didn't show up, so it was just Jordan showing. But he's like, you just have to trust the process. Tip number 4 is to have fun. This is like we all have other jobs that we're doing. Like this should be fun. We should be able to, we did this we're building relationships. In the Strong Towns PDX group, what they do is they meet monthly, and then sort of like in between weeks, they will do just socials. So they'll get together for a beer, for coffee. They'll do a board game night. You just become friends. You become friends with kindred spirits in your community. And then tip number 5 is to include food. Another quote from Jordan Deffenbaugh, who is quite a character. He says that food breaks down barriers, not just for new participants in the group, but for leaders. So he has what he calls his recipe for becoming a leader. He says, step 1, buy a crock pot. Step 2, go to the grocery store and buy ingredients for chili. Step 3, make chili. Step 4, invite people to eat chili. Congratulations, you are now a community organizer. And this is something that my wife and I have had a lot of experience with too. We did for many years soup nights in our neighborhood where we made 3 different kinds of soup. People brought bread. Just was a great way of just connecting with one another, with neighbors. Finally, step 4, actually not finally, step 4 is to take action. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because we kind of showed this slide. This is not to, no group is doing all of these things. The vast majority of groups are doing 2, maybe 3. This is just, again, to kind of fire your imagination for the wide variety of things that are possible for your local group. We're Strong Towns, like we are all about that local context. What is happening on the ground? Who's with you in the room? So we take that very, very seriously. My encouragement is to do what you can and to start with what you know and then build on what you have and then grow that capacity over time. Don't try to solve everything at once. You're not going to be able to. You probably don't know enough at this point as to know like what the right solution is. And so do what you can, start with what you know, build on what you have, and grow your capacity over time. This is actually the part that I was really looking forward to. Step 5, this is the final step, which is celebration. It's important to celebrate your wins. We want to celebrate with you. We are a nonprofit media organization, and so we publish 500 plus articles a year, 3 podcasts a year. More videos at least once a month. So we love celebrating our local groups, as you saw last night too. So here, like these are just a few of the local conversation stories that we have run in just the last year, since our last national gathering. During the last election cycle, Bike Orem in Orem, Utah, invited all 12 city council candidates on a ride around the community. And this was a way of exposing them to the city's cycling infrastructure and to the people who are trying to improve it. Around 50 citizens participated in the ride. They got to meet the candidates and ask questions. Many of these city council candidates went on to be elected. So they have that experience. They were able to build those relationships. And later, Bike Orem won a leadership award, I think last month, won a leadership award from the city council. I mentioned the Bike Ballet. Well, it's not just Strong Towns Grand Rapids that is doing this. What we found out when Grand Rapids said, hey, we're doing this Bike Ballet thing, was that 3 other local conversations are now doing it as well. In Orem, Utah, Grand Rapids, Batavia, Illinois, and Springville, they're all doing these Bike Ballet programs. And in fact, the Grand Rapids Bike Ballet program was highlighted in it like an international magazine put out by a think tank based out of Chicago. Also from Grand Rapids, they spearheaded a letter writing campaign that saved buildings that were going to be torn down for parking, to be used for parking. In Port Huron, Michigan, Strong Port Huron organized its own letter writing campaign, collecting more than 400 letters that led to the city to pause kind of a business as usual approach for this dangerous and unproductive strode. And now they have paused it in order to work with Strong Port Huron and others in order to come up with better solutions for it. Here we've had, as I mentioned, many groups have collaborated with other local organizations. And so on Parking Day last year, our local conversations in Portland, Oregon, and Denton, Texas, collaborated with other local advocacy groups. Strong Towns PDX collaborated with CNU and the Parking Reform Network to fix a dangerous intersection. They did this all in 80 minutes. They used paint and traffic cones and excess parking spots to narrow the street and improve the crosswalk and slow cars. She was talking in our session earlier that they used quick drying paint so that cars wouldn't get it on their wheels and no one would get hit by cars as they were going by. They also did this early in the morning. And they checked with bus schedule because this was one of them that they did not ask permission to do ahead of time. And it actually has led to some really cool things that now the city is stepping up. And then in Denton, Texas, Stronger Denton worked with 16 different local groups to convert excess parking spots into parklets and outside living rooms with potted plants, games, couches, information tables, and advocates ready to have conversations about Denton's future. Chuck mentioned this one last night. After a fatal crash in Chattanooga, Strong Chattanooga helped rally people to speak up at City Hall. 39 people testified about that crash. And the city not only listened, but acted, starting by temporarily narrowing the dangerous street using orange construction barrels as a first measure. In Cincinnati, Ohio, right here in Cincinnati, after a child was hit by a car, Civic Cincy undertook its first tactical urbanism project to draw attention to the dangerous conditions for people living, walking, and biking in that neighborhood, especially children. They did the session here at the National Gathering. I mentioned Strong Town Sioux Falls. They were one of our original local conversations. Started out with Jordan and Clinton showing up 6 weeks in a row, just the two of them. They recently got a $100,000 grant for community work in the Whittier neighborhood of Sioux Falls. I mentioned the bus campaign of Charlotte Urbanists. We have that has now other groups are now doing their own bus bench builds, including in Milwaukee and in Norman, Oklahoma. In Birmingham, Alabama, just last week, the Alabama Urbanists helped rally people in support of parking reform. And just last week, the city unanimously passed parking reforms that eliminated parking minimums citywide. I don't know if you're familiar with our crash. I'm going kind of fast on purpose because I want you to see this is just, it's like a steady flow of just great work that our groups are doing. If you're familiar with our crash analysis studio, this is something we do once a month, where every month we convene a panel of local and national experts to examine a fatal or traumatic crash that has happened somewhere around the United States or Canada. I sometimes compare it, because I've never worked in a hospital, I sometimes compare it to what I see on hospital TV shows, or if something goes wrong in a patient's room, they convene a panel, a board, and they talk to everybody who interacted with the patient, everyone who was in that room, to figure out what went wrong and how to make sure it doesn't happen again. Our towns and cities need something like that for the people who are using our streets. And so these crash analysis studios happen live over Zoom. They're very, very sober, because at minimum, someone's been badly hurt and often somebody has been killed. And then when it's over, we release recommendations from our experts, as well as speed studies, traffic studies, and all police reports on all of the collateral around it. We have now done, this month will be our 17th crash analysis studio. 10 of those crashes have originated from our local conversations, who have said, this happened in our community. We would like to be your boots on the ground to help you do a crash around this. And cities have responded. Not all of the cities, but some cities have said, because of all the attention it brings, they've started to make some of these recommendations to improve streets and intersections. Chuck also mentioned this one from Muskegon, where they came up with this innovative way of using TIF money to take what some might be considered blight, these hundreds of vacant lots, and converting them into productive use infill housing. To date, construction has been completed or started on 143 units, 61 have been contracted, and 20 more have been sold to builders. And as Chuck said last night, it has cost the taxpayers of Muskegon $0. $0 for more than 200 homes. And then, I guess I have two more. In Kalamazoo, Michigan, Kalamazoo, and actually in South Bend too, they made it easier for small-scale developers to help create pre-approved plans. Kalamazoo's program, which the Kalamazoo group supported, included a group of coalition of local groups and national supporters like the Incremental Development Alliance. They actually went further by pre-permitting homes and working with a local nonprofit to create a proof of concept project. And then finally in Sacramento, Strong Sacktown, Sacramento effectively ended single-family only zoning, creating what amounts to a new form-based code and introducing a vision for thickening up plots of land within a half a mile of existing planned transit. Isaac Gonzalez of Strong Sacktown, who was here at our gathering, says for 15 years there had been pockets of advocacy in Sacramento, but it was largely uncoordinated. He said now it's highly coordinated, and I think that Strong Sacktown has been a big part of making that happen. So how does Strong Town support local conversation leaders? We have me, but we have more than just me. For a long time, it was just me, but now my colleague Allison had moved from half-time to full-time and is supporting local conversations. My colleague Norm is helping to support local conversations, and our plan is to hire another community builder by the end of the year because the program is growing so quickly. When groups get up and running, we created a Discord server for local conversation leaders. There are over 300 people in that server now. It's constantly working together to address challenges that they're facing. We have formal and informal Zoom hangouts. We do office hours. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I do what I call open door, where I essentially just work on Zoom for an hour, and if anybody needs to pop in and ask a question or just wants to tell a story, I'm there. We do monthly resource emails, provide a ton of technical assistance, some of which I can provide, but then I have access to all of the Strongtown staff and all of the people that I know to answer technical assistance questions. When you start up a local conversation, you don't pay for courses anymore, like our courses in our academy. You are the ones on the ground doing the work. And so if you and your group, like if there's a course that we've created in the academy that would help you in the work that you're doing, like we're just going to get it to you. You're the one, we're only successful if you're successful. So we make those available. I talked about the Not Just Bikes and discussion guides. We have the Action Lab. We have 9,000 articles that we published over the course of the last dozen years. Our Action Labs where we curate our best and most actionable content. We have this new LC structure that I've kind of been describing throughout of this process. That new course, the success stories. Every year we do a local conversations week. All right, so we are going into a win at 3:15? I'm going to pause there. I actually do have some more slides. Oh wait, I wanted to talk about Brindle more. In case I don't get to it. I'll conclude this story. All right, so the Islanders, if you remember, had a sliver of the research. I really hope this lands. If it doesn't, you're going to know a lot more about the Isle of Lewis in Scotland. Okay, so the Islanders who opposed the wind farm, we've already established they had a fraction of the resources. So how are they going to do this? So what they decided to do was to demonstrate to that what looked like mere space to outsiders was actually a beloved particular place to locals. They created maps and photographs and paintings and narratives that showed how nature and human culture had been coexisting on the moor for some 8,000 years. They gathered 19th and early 20th century poems and folk songs that concern the moor. They mapped their favorite moor walks. This is what I love. Several locals even compiled a peat glossary, which they describe as a counter-desecration phrase book. How is that for a phrase? A counter-desecration phrase book. They surveyed the residents of 3 villages on the Isle of Lewis, and they discovered that more than 120 terms and counting that locals used to describe the peat on the moor. And they expected to add dozens more as they surveyed additional villages. There was a specific word that meant a green bow-shaped area of moor grass or moss formed by the winding of a stream. There was a specific word. I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not gonna try. But there was another word that meant a quivering bog with water trapped beneath it in an intact surface. There was a specific word that meant a hole in the moor, often wet, where an animal might get stuck. There was a word that meant the shadows cast on the moorlands by clouds moving across the sky on a bright and windy day. There was a word that meant the practice of placing quartz stones in streams so they would sparkle in the moonlight and attract salmon in the late summer and autumn. And this is what McFarland said, and this is why I think it relates to local conversations. This is the language of looking and of touching and appreciating. It was the language of use, the need to name that which is being done, and the need to love that which is being done. These phrases had grown out of what residents on the Isle of Lewis had seen and experienced over many generations. What I find really interesting as a writer is to consider, and Robert McFarland gets into this, which came first? The word for a thing or the noticing of a thing? I cannot help but connect this to Jane Jacobs and Eyes on the Street. Robert Moses, like I've seen video footage of him and like the plans he was making for New York and the architect like Le Corbusier in Paris. Many of these projects were imagined literally as flyover country, as helicopters flying over Paris, or as planners walking around room-sized models of New York City and having big dreams about these neighborhoods that were abstractions. And here's Jane Jacobs, and she's talking about the eyes on the street and how it works at the ground level. This is the language of experience and love and touch and use. These efforts on the Isle of Lewis, the maps, the art, the stories, paid off. And the wind farm application was rejected and the Brimble Moor was saved. Robert Macfarlane says, it is probable that having such precise language helped them to see their place with more affection and attentiveness. What I was going to kind of go through, and I'm not going to do this anymore, I was going to talk about how local conversations are effective, and at Strong Towns, we lead with the data. We're all about like hashtag do the math, right? Like we're going to show that the suburban experiment financially it cannot pay for itself over time. We have those numbers. The suburban experiment, we have the numbers, has failed. But we also don't stop with the data. We talk about it from the standpoint of the people who live there and what it's like to experience neighborhoods. More than that, I would say, is we talk about it from the standpoint of love. We are people who love our places. That is what's gotten us into the game, is we care for our places. And I'm going to open this up to questions, but I would like to finish, if it's okay, by reading a poem by Wendell Berry, Kentucky writer. I mentioned this, I quoted a little bit of this in my last session, but I think that this is who we are as advocates. Because somebody asked me, this came to mind, somebody said, how do you keep from getting so discouraged? How do you keep from getting so discouraged? Not just in your own place, but as you look what's happening nationally. And nerd that I am, I read this poem. And he starts by saying, it is hard to have hope. It's harder as you grow old. For hope must not depend on feeling good, and there is the dream of loneliness at absolute midnight. You also have withdrawn belief in the present reality of the future, which will surely surprise us. And hope is harder when it cannot come by prediction any more than wishing. But stop dithering. The young ask the old to hope. What will you tell them? Tell them at least what you say to yourself. Because we have not made our lives to fit our places, the forests are ruined, the fields eroded, the streams polluted, the mountains overturned. This is my favorite part, what I quoted last session. He says, hope then to belong to your place by your own knowledge of what it is that no other place is. And by caring for it as you care for no other place. This place that you belong to, though it is not yours. For it was from the beginning and will be to the end. Belong to your place by knowledge of the others who are your neighbors in it. The old man, sick and poor, who comes like a heron to fish in the creek, and the fish in the creek, and the heron who manlike fishes for the fish in the creek, and the birds who sing in the trees, and the silence of the fishermen, and the heron, and the trees that keep the land they stand upon, as we too must keep it or die. This knowledge cannot be taken from you by power or by wealth. It will stop your ears to the powerful when they ask you for your faith, and to the wealthy when they ask you for your land and your work. Answer with knowledge of the others who are here, and how to be here with them. By this knowledge, make the sense you need to make. By it, stand in the dignity of good sense, whatever may follow. I'm almost finished here. Speak to your fellow humans as your place has taught you to speak, as it has spoken to you. Speak its dialect, as your old compatriots spoke it before they heard a radio. Speak publicly what cannot be taught or learned in public. And then I'll skip to the end. He says, no place at last is better than the world. The world is no better than its places. Its places at last are no better than their people, while their people continue in them. When the people make dark the light within them, the world darkens. the great privilege that I have as community builder for Strong Towns is that every single day, every single week, I get to meet people like you and people who are starting these local groups, people who, why am I getting emotional? I don't know. People who love their places, people who have decided to root themselves in their places and have said, I'm doing this work not just for myself, but for my kids, for my grandkids, for the kids I won't have and the grandkids I won't have, but for the people who come after me. And it's an incredibly inspiring thing to do. And then I get to share it with people like Asha, my colleague over here, and say, if you ever forget who we're working with and why we're doing it, let me tell you about some of the people I met today. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left for questions. I would love to answer